Semester number 2, lesson number 28. Our aim today is how did the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and development of NATO exemplify the U.S. policy of containment? And we will learn what all those things mean in a second. But if we look, at what we've been talking about over the past few weeks with World War II, when we talk about the Allies, two of the countries that were part of the Allied powers were the United States and the Soviet Union. And from day one, and that starts actually in World War One, the United States did not like the idea of communism. They didn't like the concept of communism, and they feared communism. If you remember the initial Red Scare, 1919, there was always this fear of communism. However, when Hitler comes to power, all right, it became basically um, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And although the United States and Soviet Union did not get along, they had a common enemy who was Hitler. So during World War II, they kind of disregarded their own disagreements and, you know, fought on the same side to rid the world of Hitler. However, when World War II is over and Germany is no longer a threat, we're going to see that the United States and the Soviet Union do not trust each other, and this is going to bring about a time period known as the Cold War. And the Cold War, just to give you guys an idea, the Cold War was not a real war by any means. All right, it was basically rocky relations between these two countries, or they had a really cold relationship with each other. And the things we'll talk about today with the Cold War are the Iron Curtain, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and NATO. All right. And the origins of the Cold War. The US and Soviet Unions had very different ambitions for the future. The Soviet Union operated under a communist system, while the United States operated under a capitalist system. And in terms of their political system, the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship, while the United States was a democracy. And that was very different in terms of the way the two countries were run. In some ways, the Americans and the Soviets became more suspicious of each other during the war. Um, by the end of World War II, Stalin was very untrusting of Harry Truman, who had taken over for FDR. And one of the things that really scared um, Stalin was when the United States dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, he was not aware that the United States had the nuclear power, and that was a fearful first step in this problem. Um, we're gonna watch a clip in class, a YouTube clip by Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the end of the war. A very famous figure in the war and at the end of the war, and he deems the Iron Curtain. All right, the Iron Curtain was this imaginary line, and if you look at the picture on the right, this imaginary line through Europe that divided the west of this line, or to the left in this case, west of this line was considered democratic, and east of this line was considered communist. And this imaginary line had been created in Europe separating democracy and communism. And Churchill called this line the Iron Curtain. That's going to be in the speech we watch tomorrow. This really sets the stage for separating the world into uh, two different ideologies, uh, basically communist and democracy. And when we talk about this time period after World War One, I'm sorry, after World War Two, there are really only two big countries that matter. They're the two superpowers. All right, the United States, which symbolizes democracy, and the Soviet Union, which symbolizes communism. All of the other countries fall under those two umbrellas. Now, the United States is very fearful of the spread of communism. All right. The idea of communism, which, if you guys remember back to last year in Global, the idea of communism and the spreading of communism, they wanted this worldwide revolution, spreading communism to all parts of the globe. And the United States was fearful that this would eventually get over into the United States. The Truman Doctrine, Harry Truman on the right there in that picture, basically symbolized a policy of containment. And you need to underline, highlight, circle, star that word. It is an incredibly important word that I guarantee will be on the Regents. Containment is the policy the United States took up after World War II. All right, and this policy is to prevent the spread or contain communism only where it already existed. Now, if you think about someone who is extremely sick and contagious, all right, maybe it's too late to help them, but you want to make sure they don't spread their disease, so you quarantine them. That's basically the concept of containment, stopping the spread of communism. Their goal was not to get rid of communism where it already was, because they knew that was an impossible feat. But at the same time, they thought they could stop the spread of communism. And the way they thought they could stop the spread of communism was helping out countries who, they thought may fall to communism. And the Truman Doctrine helps out Greece and Turkey by providing them with financial aid, food, and medical to make sure they did not turn communist. Following off that and expanding on that is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a plan created by the United States to provide financial aid to rebuild Western Europe. Basically, it was to some extent free money to ensure that Western Europe was rebuilt in a way that the United States liked, aka it was built up to be democratic. All right, the goal was to make Western Europe strong again and prevent the spread of communism. Once again, this concept of containment, contain the spread of communism. We're gonna have a few talking points. The first one: do you agree with the United States policy of containment in the years following World War II? Why or why not? Explain using evidence. The second one: why do you think the United States was willing to give away millions of dollars in economic aid to countries of Western Europe? Do you believe this was a smart move by the United States? Explain. I will also call on a few of you to provide your own questions. Make sure you are prepared. If not, it's going to be, reflected in your participation grade. The United States also spearheaded a new group called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And NATO was basically an alliance between the U.S. and Western European nations, uh, basically to fight the spread of communism by forming an alliance. Um, in April of 1949, the U.S. and 11 Western European nations signed a collective security agreement known as NATO. This agreement bound the participating nations to act together for the common defense. Basically, this created an alliance among democratic countries, both in the United States and in Western Europe. And the goal was to make sure that communism did not interfere in their way of life. When this was created, the Soviets felt threatened, so they created their own type of pact known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a mutual defense treaty between 8 communist states of Eastern Europe in existence during the Cold War. The formation of the Warsaw Pact was in some ways a response to the creation of NATO, although it did not occur until 6 years after the Western Alliance came into being. So this happened 6 years after NATO. It was more directly inspired by the rearming of West Germany and its admission into NATO in 1955. And we'll talk more about Germany in future lessons. But basically, view NATO and the Warsaw Pact as teams. NATO is Team United States, Team Democracy. The Warsaw Pact is Team Soviet Union, Team Communism. And that's really what it comes down to. And we'll talk more about that in class. But really, it just separates the world more into democracy and communism. So, some more talking points. Why were NATO and the Warsaw Pact so important in shaping the political map during the Cold War? What was the true significance of these groups? And do you believe the United States handled their foreign policy correctly following World War II? Why or why not? Explain using details from the PowerPoints and our discussions. All right. Your check for understanding today. The primary goal of the United States foreign policy of containment was to A. Return to non involvement in world affairs, B. Stop communist influence from spreading, C. Gain territories in Africa and Latin America, or D. Overthrow existing dictatorships. And we will talk more about that answer tomorrow. Tomorrow in class we will be working on multiple choice questions in preparation for the Regents exam. Have a good night.